The wind howled across the rocky hill, carrying dust and silence with it. John, a human man living alone on the edge of the galaxy, walked slowly through the dry brush. He was searching for firewood, as he did every day. His small cabin, made from old metal scraps, stood at the bottom of the hill. It was simple, but enough for one man. John liked peace. He liked silence. And he liked staying away from crowded spaceports and noisy cities. But that day, something was different as he reached the top of the hill. He saw a shape lying near a dying fire. It was small, curled up, and shaking from the cold wind. At first, he thought it was some desert animal, but as he moved closer, he saw soft silver skin, long dark hair, and glowing blue eyes barely open. It was a woman, not human, alien. She wore thin clothes, torn and dirty. Her hands were wrapped around her knees, and her body looked weak. John slowly knelt beside her. She didn't move. Her eyes blinked once, watching him without trust. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick blanket, without saying a word. He placed it over her shoulders. She flinched, but didn't stop him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. John stood up, looked around, then gently lifted her into his arms. She was cold, too light, and barely breathing. He carried her down the hill, one careful step at a time. The wind grew louder, but John didn't stop. He had seen death before, and this woman was close to it. Inside his cabin, he placed her on his cot. He wrapped her in 2 more blankets and placed a heated stone near her feet. Then he sat by the fire and watched her sleep. All night, she didn't move. But in the early morning, her fingers twitched. Then her eyes opened slowly, looking around the room. She saw the human man sitting by the fire, drinking warm broth from a wooden bowl. He noticed her stare and gave a small smile. "You're safe now," he said softly. She didn't reply. She just blinked and looked at the fire. Her hands were still shaking. John stood up and placed a bowl of broth near her. She didn't touch it at first. Then slowly, she reached for it and took a small sip. The heat made her eyes close, as if she hadn't tasted warmth in a long time. They didn't talk that day. She didn't speak. And he didn't ask questions. John spent the day chopping wood and gathering water. She watched him from the cot, wrapped in layers of warmth. He noticed how her eyes followed his every move, not in fear, but in confusion, as if she couldn't believe someone would help her. That night, she sat closer to the fire, still silent. John handed her a stone pendant carved with simple patterns. "It keeps heat longer," he said, placing it in her hand. She looked at it, then at him. Still no words. But she didn't let go of the pendant. Then something strange happened. A distant sound echoed from the forest metal scraping rock. The alien woman froze, her body stiff, her eyes filled with fear. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked. Toward the door, John stood and picked up his old hunting rifle. "Stay here," he said. Stepping outside, he found nothing but shadows. When he returned, she hadn't moved. He sat down again, watching her carefully. "You're running from something," he said gently. Still no answer. But tears filled her eyes. And she looked down at the pendant. She whispered something, a word he didn't understand. It sounded like Shaolin, maybe her name. John leaned back and said, "I'll build you something better than this shack." She looked up, confused. He pointed to the stones outside. "Stone doesn't burn," he said. "Stone doesn't break easily." She didn't respond. But her eyes didn't look afraid anymore. Only tired, only curious. That night, John lay on the floor, letting her sleep in his bed. The wind blew. Cold outside, but the fire burned steady inside the small cabin. 2 very different souls shared silence, and for the first time in her life, the alien woman felt something close to safety. Not many words were spoken, but something had already begun. A quiet bond, built not with language, but with kindness and stones. *, the sun rose behind the dry hills. and the air was still cool. John stepped out of his small cabin, carrying a heavy basket. He didn't say a word, just walked toward the stone-covered area he had marked the day before. Behind him, the alien woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her silver skin caught the sunlight, and her hair swayed slightly in the breeze. She didn't understand what he was doing, but her eyes stayed on him, curious and quiet. He moved like someone with a purpose, lifting large stones, arranging them one by one. The pile slowly grew as the morning passed. He stopped only to wipe the sweat from his brow, then kept working. The woman sat down outside, her legs still weak, her hands resting on her knees. She watched every movement, wondering why this human was building something for her by midday. She stood up slowly and walked toward him. He noticed her and smiled, then pointed to a flat rock and tapped it twice. She tilted her head and touched it with her fingers, feeling its weight. It was smooth on one side, rough on the other. He showed her how he placed it next to another stone, fitting them tightly like puzzle pieces. She didn't speak, but something shifted in her eyes. Every day after that, she followed him. She didn't talk, but she helped. She gathered small rocks, carried buckets of water, and brushed dust away from the flat stones. Sometimes she just sat nearby, drawing in the dirt. With a stick, circles, symbols, stars, things he didn't understand. He asked once, "Is this your writing?" She looked at him, then down at her drawings. She tapped her chest and whispered, "Home." Her voice was soft and dry, like she hadn't used it in weeks. John nodded slowly, understanding her meaning. He started carving simple lines into the stone walls as they built them. She pointed at his carvings and added her own symbols beside them. They worked in silence, but something was being said between them. Even without words, one evening, as the sky turned orange, they sat side by side on the ground. He handed her a canteen of water, and she took a slow sip. She looked up at the half-finished stone house, its walls strong and tall. Her eyes grew distant, like she was remembering something from far away without warning. She reached out and touched his hand. He looked at her, surprised. She said one word, barely louder than the wind. "Shalin." He repeated it gently. "Shalin." She nodded once, her eyes shining in the fading light that night. Strange lights appeared in the sky, 3 red streaks, moving fast. John stood outside, watching carefully. Beside him, Shalin stepped forward, her body tense, her hand gripping his arm. He noticed how she trembled, not from the cold, but from fear. "Do you know them?" he asked. She didn't answer, but she didn't let go of his arm either. The lights vanished behind the hills, and the night returned to silence. Shalin walked back inside and sat near the fire. Hugging her knees, John placed more wood into the flames, then sat beside her. "I don't know what you're running from," he said quietly, "but you're not alone anymore." She didn't reply, but her head slowly rested on his shoulder. The stone house was only half built, but already it felt like something strong, something safe, something that neither war nor silence could break. Outside, the desert winds whispered secrets. Inside, 2 souls found something better than words, a beginning. The wind had calmed that morning, but a strange silence hung in the air. John stepped outside and ran his hand along the rising stone wall. It now stood as high as his chest, firm and smooth. Beside him, Shalin placed her hand on the stones, too, her fingers tracing the lines they had carved together. Her eyes glowed faintly, just enough to catch the sunlight. She had been calmer lately, more steady, but today she seemed different, quiet but not peaceful. John handed her a small chisel and pointed to a corner of the wall. She nodded and began carving gently, slow and careful strokes. But as she worked, her breathing changed and her hands shook. The symbol she carved looked like a swirl inside a circle. She stared at it for a long moment before pulling her hand away suddenly. John stepped closer and touched the mark. It felt cold colder than the stone around it. He looked at her, confused. Shalin took a step back and whispered, "This stone." It remembers he didn't understand what she meant. She knelt down and placed her palm flat on the ground. Her eyes closed, and for a few seconds, she didn't move. Then she opened them and said softly, "This land, it is old." World, John listened, saying nothing. He had never heard her speak more than one word at a time. Now her voice was calm, but filled with something ancient. She looked up at him and added, "Your stone speaks like ours, but yours does not sleep." John looked at the half-built walls, the symbols they had carved together. Maybe this wasn't just a shelter anymore. Maybe it was becoming something else. He stepped back and noticed a faint shimmer in the carvings, not light from the sun, but something from inside the stone itself. He blinked and looked again, but the shimmer was gone. That night, while John slept, Shalin sat near the wall, staring at the symbols. She touched the cold swirl she had made earlier and whispered something in her own language. The wind outside picked up again, and the stones hummed quietly. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply for a moment. She didn't feel like a hunted fugitive or a broken soldier. She felt like someone who once had a name, a home, a place among her people. But the feeling faded quickly. Memories of fire, screams, and betrayal rushed back. She opened her eyes quickly and looked around the dark cabin. John was asleep, peaceful as always. She envied that. The next day, they continued building. More stones, more patterns. More silent hours spent together under the open sky. But as they worked, a low sound echoed from the distance. It was mechanical soft at first, but growing louder. Shalin froze and grabbed John's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. He followed her eyes to the sky. A black drone hovered above the ridge, its lights scanning the ground. John cursed under his breath and pulled Shalin behind one of the walls. The drone passed slowly, circling once before flying off toward the mountains. Shalin's face was pale, her breath shallow. She sat down on the ground, hugging her knees. "Tightly, they are close," she said quietly. "They search everywhere." John sat beside her and asked, "Why are they hunting you?" Shalin didn't answer at first. She looked at the stones again, then touched her chest. "I was not what they wanted," she said. "I broke their law. I saved the wrong lives." John didn't press further. He just nodded and said, "Then I'm glad I found you." Shalin looked at him, confused. "Why?" She asked. "I bring danger. I bring war." John gave a small smile. "You bring meaning," he said. "This house, it's not just for you. It's for something good." Later that night, as stars filled the sky, Shalin stood alone by the stone wall. She placed both hands on it and whispered something ancient. The carvings glowed faintly again. Just for a moment, she turned and looked at the cabin behind her. For the first time, it looked like a real home. And for the first time, she hoped it would last. The fire crackled gently inside the cabin. John sat sharpening a tool near the open door. While Shalin stared into the flames with blank eyes, the stone walls outside were almost complete, standing strong like silent guards, but inside her heart, a storm still raged. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces, fire, and the cold metal hands of her past. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in days. But John never pushed her. He gave her space, warmth, and quiet. He spoke sometimes about small things, trees, tools, memories of Earth, but not once did he ask her for her story. And that silence felt more gentle than any question. That night, the sky turned red with distant storms. Thunder rumbled low, like an old beast waking up. Shalin stood at the doorway, watching the sky. The wind pulled at her hair, and for the first time, she spoke without being asked. "You want to know the truth," she said, her voice calm, but heavy. John paused, then nodded. "Only if you want to tell me." She sat down on the floor, cross-legged, her fingers curled into the blanket around her shoulders. "I was born on a warship," she began, her eyes far away. "I never saw grass, or rivers, or soft light like this." Her voice didn't shake, but it felt hollow. "I was trained to fight since childhood, like many others. No kindness, no freedom. Just orders." John listened, not speaking, not even blinking. "We were used to conquer planets," she continued, "to crush rebels, to silence voices, even the innocent." She took a long breath, her hand clutching her knee tightly. "I followed orders until the day I didn't." Her eyes lowered, and her voice turned sharper. "We attacked a colony, small, peaceful, like this." She pointed at the fire, as if it represented the place. "But I saw a child hiding under a table, just like me once." She swallowed hard. "I let her go. I let many go. They called me broken." John leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "They branded me a traitor, locked me in chains, and threw me on a prison ship." Her lip trembled, the first crack in her calm mask. "But I escaped during a crash. And I've been running ever since." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire hissed softly as a log shifted. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but loud. Finally, John stood up and walked to the shelf. He poured warm tea into a wooden cup and placed it beside her. "You saved lives," he said gently. "That's not weakness." Shalin stared at the tea, then at him. "It cost me everything," she said. "My name, my people, my purpose." John knelt down in front of her. "But not your soul." She looked at him, unsure what to say. He didn't look at her like the others had, not like a weapon, or a threat, or a mistake. Just like a person. Maybe the first one who ever did. Her hands reached for the cup, and she held it close. The warmth seeped into her fingers. Steadying her breath, "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You didn't even know me." John smiled, tired but kind. "You were freezing, dying, alone. What else was I supposed to do?" She shook her head. "Most would have left." "I'm not most," he replied. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut. Making her jump, he reached over and opened it again, letting the smoke clear. "You built me a home," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "No," John said. "We built it together." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Slowly, a tear rolled down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away that night. She didn't sit far from him. She sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in silence for the first time. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, like soft music with no sound. The storm outside faded before midnight, but inside the stone house something new had formed, stronger than walls, deeper than shelter. Sholin closed her eyes and whispered something in her language. John didn't ask what it meant, but she answered anyway. "It means thank you." And just like that, the space between a hunted alien and a lonely human disappeared. Not with a kiss, not with words, but with understanding. A home had been built from stone, yes, but a bond had been carved deeper than any wall could hold. The sound came at dawn, low and sharp, like metal dragging across stone. John woke instantly, sitting up with his hand already reaching for the old hunting rifle by the door. Shalin was already standing, her body tense, her breath held like she could hear every shift in the wind. The quiet hills that once brought peace now held something unnatural. They both stepped outside. The sky still dark with the last hour of night on the far ridge. 3 figures appeared, shadows with red eyes. They weren't walking. They were gliding, smooth and silent. Shalin's face went pale, her knees bent slightly, her hand resting near her boot like she was ready to run. John didn't move. He just lifted the rifle slowly, not to fire, just to hold it close. "They found me," she whispered. John didn't ask how. He only said, "Then let them speak to me." As the three shadows came closer, John stepped forward, placing himself. Between them and the stone house, Shalin stayed behind him, but not far. The first figure stopped a few meters away, its body tall and covered in armor that pulsed with red light. It spoke in a cold, robotic voice. "Surrender the fugitive." John's voice was calm, but sharp. "There's no fugitive here. She is a criminal of the Arkan fleet." The figure replied, "She broke war laws and must be returned." Shalin stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud enough. "I saved children," she said. "Your war laws killed them." The figure's head turned toward her slowly. "You were not programmed to think," it replied. John's hands tightened on the rifle. "She's not a machine," he said. "She's free, and she's not going anywhere with you." There was silence. Then the second figure raised a weapon from its shoulder. A small laser flicked to life, glowing like a warning. John didn't flinch. "I built this home with stone," he said, "and no one tears it down without going through me." The wind picked up again, and dust swirled between them. "You cannot stop us, human," the figure said. John stepped forward once more. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I won't back down either." Shalin looked at him, something strange in her eyes, part shock, part something else. She took a step to his side, her voice strong now. "If you take me, I'll die," she said, "but I won't run anymore." John looked at her, then back at the armored aliens. "Then we fight," he said simply. But the first figure didn't attack. It turned and looked at the house, its stone walls, its ancient carvings, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the low light. "This place is not yours," it said. "What have you awakened?" John didn't understand, but Shalin did. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the stone wall. The markings began to glow brighter, lines of light crawling across the surface like vines. The ground trembled beneath their feet. "She is bonded to this ground now," the figure said, its voice suddenly unsure. Then it stepped back slowly. "We will return," it warned with force. The three figures disappeared into the dust, vanishing like smoke. John lowered the rifle and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shalin was still touching the wall, her face filled with something heavy and ancient. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. "I called it," she whispered. "I don't know how." But the stone listened. They stood there in silence for a long time, the light growing slowly as morning rose. John turned to her and said, "We have to prepare." She nodded once. "No more hiding," she said. "If they come back, they will find more than a fugitive." And for the first time, John saw it in her eyes, not fear, not sorrow, but fire. The kind that burns quietly at first, but never goes out. He knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. But he also knew she wouldn't face it alone. Inside the stone house, the walls hummed faintly with energy older than war. Symbols carved by two hands, two worlds, now pulsed like a heartbeat. Whatever power had been buried there was awake now, and no one would take her, not while he stood breathing. Not while the stone still stood. The night before the storm felt too calm. The air was still. Not even the dry desert wind dared to move. John stood on the roof of the half-finished stone house, tying a sharp wire between two wooden poles. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Every sound in the distance made him glance toward the hills. He didn't know how many would come, or what they would bring. But he knew they were coming. Inside, Shalin sat cross-legged on the floor, her palms flat against the glowing stone. The strange energy had returned, pulsing through the walls in soft blue light. It was like something ancient had woken up inside her, and this time she didn't push it away. She welcomed it. Memories flooded her mind, voices from childhood, chants from battle training. Her people had buried their oldest powers out of fear, but now she reached into those lost echoes and whispered old words that made the stones tremble. John walked in quietly, watching her from the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. Shalyn opened her eyes slowly, and for the first time her voice sounded full and strong. "I remember who I am now," she said, "and what they fear," just before sunrise. The sky lit up with a sharp red glow. Dozens of small ships passed over the hills, slow and silent. The ground vibrated as 3 of them landed not far from the house. John loaded his rifle again and stood beside the door. Shalyn didn't run. She stepped outside and looked straight at the ships, her silver hair floating in the morning wind. A line of armored soldiers marched toward them, their weapons humming. Softly, but Shalyn stepped forward, placing herself between them and the house. John moved to follow, but she raised her hand. "Stay close," she said, "but not in front." She raised her arms, her hands glowing with soft blue light. The soldiers stopped in place. Unsure, confused, one of them shouted, "Surrender now, or we will open fire." Shalyn's voice echoed across the land. "You came here to capture me," she said. "But you woke something far older than me." She slammed both hands onto the ground, and the earth cracked beneath her, from beneath the soil. Blue light burst like roots of energy, spreading toward the stone house. The walls lit up like they were alive, symbols shining with ancient force. The soldiers stepped back, weapons raised. One of them fired. The beam hit the ground near her feet, but it did nothing. A blue shield shimmered around her, thin like glass. But strong as steel. John stared in awe, but didn't move. He trusted her, even when he didn't understand. Shalyn took another step forward and whispered a word that had no human meaning. The stone wall behind her pulsed and exploded outward, not in destruction, but in motion. Blocks of stone floated into the air, circling her slowly like a crown. "I am not a fugitive," she shouted. "I am a keeper of what you tried to bury." The wind rose fast and wild, swirling around her body. The soldiers began to retreat, but it was too late. A wave of blue light swept across them, disabling their weapons, bending their metal armor. Like paper, they dropped to their knees, some unconscious, others simply paralyzed by fear. John ran to her side, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay?" Her body trembled, not from pain, but from power. She looked at him and gave a faint smile. "It's not finished yet," she said. "They'll send more." The ground calmed, and the air grew quiet again. The ships rose into the sky, taking the fallen soldiers with them. None dared stay behind, not after what they saw. Not after what she became. Shalyn collapsed into John's arms, her body weak, her energy nearly gone. He carried her inside, placing her gently near the warm wall. The stone glowed softer now, as if it was breathing with her. "You saved us both," John said, holding her hand. She nodded, eyes half closed. "No," she whispered. "You saved me first." That night, no wind came. No footsteps echoed. Only the sound of her quiet breathing and the calm beating of something ancient. For the first time, the stone house stood not just as a home, but as a warning. She was no longer hunted. She had become the storm they feared. No one approached the stone house after that day. For a time, the hills were quiet again, not out of peace, but out of fear. Word spread faster than ships could fly that an exiled alien woman had awakened something ancient, that a human man had stood alone between war and mercy, and that together they changed the land itself. But inside the house, things were quieter. Shalyn moved slowly, her body still weak but healing. The stone seemed to hum gently wherever she placed her hands. It pulsed with warmth, like a heart had formed beneath it. John spent his days strengthening the walls, not because they needed protection now, but because the house was growing room by room, stone by stone. One afternoon, as the sky turned soft with light rain, A small figure appeared near the far ridge. It was not a soldier, nor a hunter, but a child alien. Alone, thin, Shalin stepped outside first. Her voice gentle, but firm. "You don't need to run anymore." The child looked scared, but nodded and followed her toward the house. The next day, 2 more come silent, wide-eyed exiles. A mother and her child, dirty and hungry. John opened the door for them. No questions asked. Within a week, 7 lived inside the stone house. By the next moon, there were 20. They came from broken ships, ruined camps, forgotten colonies. All had nowhere to go until they found the stone that glowed with her voice. John built extra rooms with their help. Some gathered water, some cut stone. Others cared for the injured. Shalin walked among them like a quiet guardian. They didn't call her commander or queen. They called her keeper, the one who stayed when no one else did. One evening, she and John sat atop the roof, watching fires flicker in the nearby hills. New homes were being built, small, round, with carved stones, just like the first. John handed her a carved stone pendant, something he had made from a leftover piece of wall. Shalin held it close to her chest, her eyes soft. "This was never your fight," she said. John smiled faintly. "It became mine the moment I saw you curled in the cold." They sat without speaking for a long time. Below them, children laughed. Voices echoed, tools clinked against rock. Life had returned to a place built from silence and fear. Now it stood strong because 2 people had chosen kindness over retreat. In the months that followed, ships came again, but they didn't come to fight. Some came to kneel, others to ask questions, and a few simply to listen. They were told, "You don't need permission to build a home, just someone to believe in you." The message reached farther than the desert ever could, across trade stations, broken colonies, and quiet corners of the galaxy. People spoke of the stone house where no one was turned away. Shalin sometimes stood outside at night, her hands on the wall. She could still feel it breathe with her. The ancient power hadn't left it, had simply changed. It no longer defended her with fire and shields. Now it defended others with walls and warmth. John planted a small tree beside the house. It struggled in the dry ground, but each day he watered it without fail. "Even stone needs a shadow," he said. Shalin didn't understand at first, but over time the meaning became clear. Stone was strong, but the tree gave it grace. One day, Shalin walked through the rows of new homes and saw a girl drawing symbols in the dirt. They were her symbols, the ones from her past. The child looked up and said, "My mother told me you saved her." Shalin knelt down and nodded. "She saved herself," she said softly. "I just gave her a wall to lean on that night." As stars lit the sky in silence, John and Shalin stood side by side outside the first house. It wasn't just stone anymore. It was memory. It was proof that mercy could be louder than war, that love could be built one stone at a time. Shalin looked up at the stars and whispered, "I was meant to be erased." John put his arm gently around her and said, "Then let's write something stronger." And they did. Not with weapons, not with orders, but with kindness, grit, and the one thing no one had given her before, a home.